Hi, this is Dr. Giobbi. We're looking now at Chapter 5 of our child counseling textbook, and this is psychoanalytic counseling. This is an overwhelming chapter. The amount of information that's contained here is quite overwhelming, and a child counseling course is a course that's specific to counseling children, applying counseling techniques to children. Ideally, and I don't know if this is the case, but ideally this would be a course that would be taken after one would take an Introduction to Counseling course. So you would first obviously take Theories of Personality. A good deal of this chapter, maybe the first quarter of the chapter, is devoted to a brief biography of Sigmund Freud and a brief history of the psychoanalytic movement, and then an introduction to basic Freudian theory of personality. This should be covered in a Theories of Personality course, as well as the basic concepts of psychodynamic counseling would be covered in an Introduction to Counseling course, or an Introduction to Clinical Psychology course. And then we would ideally apply these concepts to working with children in this course. So with that in mind, I'm going to forgo discussing the biography of Freud and any in-depth understanding of Freudian psychodynamic theory. The theory of this I'm going to necessarily have to discuss a bit. But an in-depth study of this stuff would really be done in a Theories of Personalities course. Now, I have recorded Theories of Personality lectures that I have made available to the public, and I'll put those links in on our Canvas. But I really want to discuss the clinical ideas in this chapter. And so that's what I'm going to do. And let's just say that where I would begin in this chapter, and I'm recording this thinking to myself that this is one of a number of chapters that you have to read this week and process. And quite frankly, I don't know how you do this. It's not the time constraint is not ideal here. You're going to have to not read this chapter once, but this is a chapter you're going to read 2 or 3 times. So save your book. And when the course is over, make sure that you really read and process and think about these things. I guess a good place to begin is to tell you to read the case studies at the end of the chapter. These case studies are invaluable to understanding how psychoanalytic or psychodynamic counseling proceeds. And I guess it's probably a good... so don't skip these case studies. As a matter of fact, I would start with the case studies and read the case study and read the summary. So last page 169, read these case studies. And then read the summary section. You don't have to, just as the preliminary, and then go back to the beginning of the chapter and start reading. That would be the strategy I'd take. I am going to begin by also bringing to your attention that this, what's being proposed here in psychoanalytic counseling, I think would more appropriately be called psychodynamic counseling. Psychoanalytic and psychoanalysis refers to classic Freudian psychoanalysis, the classic Freudian theory. And although this chapter and these authors do introduce Freudian psychoanalytic theory, It's more beyond Freud. It incorporates some Jungian psychology. It incorporates some Ericksonian psychology. It even incorporates the work of Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, who was a child psychologist. It incorporates Winnicott psychology, psychodynamic theory. And when we talk about any of the theories that came after Freud, we usually refer to those as psychodynamic. So, for example, we don't really call Jung's theory a psychoanalytic theory. We call it a psychodynamic theory. He called his psychology analytical psychology. We're going to later turn to individual psychology. Alfred Adler, again, is greatly based on Freudian bedrock, but it deviates. It places the emphasis elsewhere. So this theory that you're learning here, this is not really Freudian. Freud didn't counsel. Freud did analysis. What is analysis? Psychoanalysis is introducing the patient to themselves. We have an analyst and we have an analysand. The analyst is the psychotherapist, the psychologist, the counselor, and the analysand is the person being analyzed. And what really makes this chapter interesting is that it's more of a contemporary approach to using psychoanalytic and psychodynamic concepts in a way of working with children. And again, this is something that really was pioneered by Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud. So keeping this in mind, we want to, again, keep the distinction between psychoanalysis, which refers to classical Freudian analysis of the psyche, introducing the analysand to themselves, and then psychodynamic theory, which really this chapter should be called psychodynamic counseling. So you are going to want to read the little biography of Freud, maybe watch, if you can manage to do so, watch a nice documentary on Freud. I'll find one to provide to you. Get familiar with a little bit of the background of his biography, because usually when we study a personality theorist's theory, we're studying about their life. If you don't have a Theories of Personality book and you haven't purchased or you haven't taken that course, get one and read it. It'll be helpful to you. So that, with those things considered, what makes psychodynamic psychotherapy different from other forms of psychotherapy? Well, I would say from my experience that there's a tendency to not fully appreciate the incredible offerings of psychodynamic theory because it really is outside the realm of laboratory psychology in many ways. We're taught that psychology is a science that's testable and observable and measurable, etc. And this becomes difficult with psychodynamic theory because in psychodynamic theory, we're dealing with the unconscious. And it's very difficult to, if possible, to measure the unconscious or even observe the unconscious. We kind of have to tease it out. The primary research methods for psychodynamic psychology is the clinical method. So that's working with patients, with analysand, with a client, and also self-observation. We can observe our own dreams. We can observe our internal states, our emotions, our feelings. These are observed. So we can observe ourselves and we can observe our clients. Now, when it comes to testing for this stuff in a laboratory setting, I don't think that that's going to be a practical. There are some people who try to apply laboratory psychology, laboratory scientific observable and measurable methods to psychoanalysis, but I haven't seen much that's very convincing to me. This is more of a clinical method. So we're dealing primarily with integrating the conscious awareness with unconscious aspects of the human condition. This is like an enlarging of consciousness. What is consciousness? It's what we're aware of. And again, now I'm giving you a very kind of contemporary psychodynamic approach. This isn't going to be strictly Freudian or Jungian or Adlerian or Ericksonian or Reichian. This is kind of a eclectic discussion of all psychodynamic theory that you can apply to counseling children. So with this in mind, in psychodynamic theory, we talk about the conscious. And what is conscious? Conscious is, now it's not conscience, it's conscious. Conscious is awareness. It's whatever we're thinking about at any given time. That's consciousness. To be conscious is to be conscious of something. So we can be conscious of stuff outside of us. We can be conscious of stuff inside of us. The external world, as we might call it, the internal world, and we can be conscious of things through our eyes, through our nose, through our tongue, through our ears, and through our skin, through our five senses. And we also have a sixth sense, and that sixth sense is nothing spooky. It's internal consciousness. It's a consciousness of introspection. And that internal conscious is being conscious of what we're thinking, being conscious of what we're feeling. Emotions. Now I'm going to use the word mood, and I'm going to use the word emotion interchangeably. So mood and emotion, feelings, I'm referring to the same thing. If the consciousness speaks the language of logic and grammar, in other words, the language that we speak, we think in our language. The unconscious speaks the language of images and emotions. So to give you an example of this, if I have a dream about, I typically have a dream image of my first car when I was a young person, and my first car was not very reliable. That car shows up in my adult dreams. Throughout my entire life, it's shown up in my dreams. And I know that when that car shows up in my dreams, it signifies a concern about reliability, a concern, an anxiety that comes with not knowing if this car is going to break down. Is it going to leave me stranded? There's an emotion that's linked to the image of this car, this 1982 Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra. So this car shows up in my dreams. Now, when I'm having a dream and the old 1982 Oldsmobile shows up, this is not a dream about my Oldsmobile. It's not a dream about that car. That car is an image that's embedded in my psyche. It's embedded in my, what Jung called personal unconscious. You're not going to have a dream about a 1982 Cutlass Sierra Oldsmobile because it's not relevant to your personal unconscious. It's relevant to my personal unconscious. And it has come to have emotional significance. It's an image. The image is the car that's loaded with an emotion, a mood, and that mood is a mixture of feelings. And when we introspect and we look internally with that sixth sense, that sense of looking internal, we can analyze our emotions that are linked with certain images. So I know when that image pops up in one of my dreams, it's meaning that I'm feeling uncertain, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling that there's questionable reliability, and it's also a sense of maybe I have to be prepared for the engine failing, so to speak. But the job then is for me to look into what that car is representing in my waking life, in what's going on in my adult life. Again, it's not about the car. It's about what the car represents. And my unconscious in my dream life, it speaks the language of images and emotions. So when you're looking at the unconscious, and one of the main ways of analyzing the unconscious is to take one's dreams seriously. I learned from undergoing a Jungian analysis about 20 years ago to really take my dreams seriously. And I do. When I have a dream that has an emotional impact on me, I listen to what it has to say. I keep a dream log. Every morning I wake up and I remain still because Jung tells us, and Freud has told us as well, that somehow our unconscious is that the memory of these dreams experiences exists throughout our whole body. And when we move first thing in the morning, we disturb the memory of the dream. So when you wake up, if you would just remain in a still position and keep your mind remaining in the dream mood, and become firstly aware of the overall mood of the dream. Is it one of bliss? Is it one of fear? Is it one of anxiety? Whatever it is, be aware of what the feeling is, because the unconscious speaks in feelings and images, moods and images. And it's our psyche working on things at a level that transcends our daily life and goes into our deep history. Jung even claimed that we have a collective unconscious in which we all share certain experiences that manifest as human beings in our dreams. So we look at this dream with an overall mood, and we then think without moving, staying very still in our bed. This is why it's also helpful not to be distracted by music or radio or someone talking. Just laying in silence and staying in the dream and thinking and replaying the dream in our minds and writing the dream down. And as you write that dream story down, in parentheses, write specific moods that are attached with specific images. So I might have a dream that was the overall mood of the dream that I woke up with was one of fear, concern, maybe anxiety. So I start off by listing the adjectives that describe the mood, and then I begin writing out the dream. And when I come to different images of the dream, I become different parts of the dream, images, I become aware of the emotion that is attached with that image. And in parentheses, as when I'm telling the story of the dream, I talk about the car, I'll put in parentheses anxiety, fear, unreliability, and then there might be a person in my dream, and that person signified hope and safety and comfort. So you start to analyze in your dream individual emotions with each aspect of the dream. And you get an overall feeling for this dream. Now, the next stage in this analysis of dreams, remember the goal here is to integrate the unconscious with the conscious, to expand our knowledge of ourselves. Because in psychoanalysis, the idea is that we protect a kind of like our ego, what we want to believe about ourselves. We protect this with different tricks, and we can hide things about ourselves that we don't want to see. And this is what we understand in the defense mechanisms. So the trick here is through approaching the dream, is to analyze the dream and see what it reveals about ourselves that we're trying to hide from ourselves so that we can protect our ego, our sense of self, our sense of identity, rather. It might be useful to realize that Jung discussed the ego, which is the sense of me, and he said that was distinctly different from the self. The self is much broader. The self includes the unconscious. We think that our self is our ego, but really our ego is just this tiny little dot, this tiny little speck of the entire self. And the goal is to expand the self. And how we expand the self is to expand consciousness into the unconscious, making the unconscious, becoming aware of it, becoming conscious. And therefore the ego begins to spread and become more aware of the entirety of the self. Very abstract concepts. It's going to take you many years of study to realize this, but I can promise you that the fruits are invaluable. What you learn from the psychodynamic theory is so useful. This idea of expanding one's sense, one's ego into the self and integrating the unconscious and the conscious together. Now, this is very interesting because, as you'll read, Freud felt that the dreams came from the unconscious and this area of the unconscious called the id, which is in Latin, id means it in English. Freud actually used the term das Es, the it. And id was used as an English translation for his American and British audiences. But in his writing, he used the term das Es, the German, the thing, the it. And he felt that this was really all those biological drives, sex drive, hunger drive, thirst drive for power, drive to dominate, the alpha male kind of business. When you see how the pack animals exist, he felt that this was a very biologically inherited and it was biologically involuntary. It was within the system. It was instinctual stuff. And this instinctual animalistic stuff we didn't want to acknowledge. He said we want to think of ourselves as non-animals, human beings that are just below the angels. Well, he dethroned this and said, no, in fact, we're animals. And evidence shows us that a lot of human beings really do act like animals in many ways, hurting others, torturing other people, torturing poor innocent animals, doing horrible things to each other and to themselves. So Freud really was onto something here when he was telling us, hey, be careful because you're trying to think that you're a hero. You're trying to think that you're above the animals, but in fact, there's a part of you that is very animalistic, and that would be the id. And that id is in the unconscious. But that's not the only thing in the unconscious. The unconscious, the personal unconscious, for Jung distinguished between personal and collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is all the things that has happened to us in our lives that are maybe forgotten or not congruent with how we want to view ourselves, so we kind of push it out of the way. Things that we were too young to remember in a conscious way, because consciousness really comes along, the sense of ego comes along with language. You know, around a year and a half is the first time that an infant, a little baby, looks into a mirror and can recognize itself, and that is in coordination with the concept of me and mine and I and no. You have to have the sense of self before you can have the concept of no and mine. My fire engine, my painting. You can't have a mine without a sense of I. And that doesn't exist until about 18 months in a human being. So there's many things that we have in ourselves that we have reason to keep hidden for ourselves. It's almost, if you can think of this, when you go and you meet someone and you want to put on your best. You want to, especially this happens in teenage years and adolescent years. You want people to view you in a certain way. So you tell a certain story about yourself, and you conveniently edit out things you don't want people to know. And you may even include things that aren't so true, fabricate things that you would like people to think about yourself, and you want to think these things about yourself. Well, for psychoanalysis, we're always in a state of deception. We're always deceiving ourselves into wanting to believe a certain story about ourselves and trying to keep hidden from ourselves inconvenient truths, inconvenient things that aren't necessarily so about ourselves. So in doing this, these things get pushed down into the unconscious along with those drives that we don't want to know about, these things ourselves that are like animalistic things about ourselves. And we want to keep that all kind of hidden. So we hide it from ourselves in an interesting trick. That's what we call repression. We repress these things. We push them down in the unconscious. And these things knock at our door. They knock at our door. And one of the times they knock is at night. And they manifest in these dreams. And in our dreams, we often have disturbing things that we are not, that we're trying to push out of consciousness. And at night, when our consciousness kind of weakens, when those defenses weaken, these emotionally charged things that we've hidden from ourselves knock on our door and kind of haunt us like demons in our sleep. Now, Freud found, and this is pretty much true of psychoanalysis, that if you open your door to these, if you answer the knock, if you pay attention to these things, they lose their sting. They kind of dissipate. You get it out of your system. That it's actually the fighting against it, it's the hiding it from ourselves that manifests in the symptoms. So what happens when something is festering that we're not paying attention to, that we're trying to ignore, something about ourselves that we don't want to acknowledge is actually a part of ourselves? It knocks on the door, and that knock comes in the form of a nightmare perhaps, or a dream of some sort that might be unpleasant. That knock can also come in the form of symptoms. Anxiety, free-floating anxiety that latches on to a certain image. It becomes depression, and in extreme forms it can become psychosis, where we lose touch with reality. We're consumed, we fall deeply into the unconscious, takes over. The id takes over, the unconscious takes over, so that we no longer live in reality of conscious ego reality, but we live in the unconscious pleasure principle dominated fantasy world. So again, we're talking about very complicated concepts here that I'm afraid are not going to sink in a week. You have to make a lifetime out of this. But I hope that I'm sharing with you enough of a first-hand experience. I can't emphasize this enough to you. I studied in my master's degree clinical psychodynamic theory. That was my emphasis. And I underwent a Jungian analysis at that time. And then I studied in my doctoral work more psychodynamic media studies, cultural studies, where we put culture on the couch and study and understand it through psychodynamic ways. So I've spent many of the past 25 years, 30 years studying, going through psychodynamic theory of all different sorts, not just Freud. And so I'm speaking to you here from a first-hand experience of how valuable this stuff can be. So we understand, we have a general understanding now of this thing called the id, and that it exists in this unconscious. And then we have the ego, which is consciousness. It's the ego is the idea we have of ourselves. There's one other component that Freud introduced called the superego. And the superego are all the things we learned from our parents, from society, about good and bad, about good little boys and bad little boys, good little girls and bad little girls. And we incorporate this into our own sense of good and bad. And often you'll hear, if you think about what's good and bad and you react to something, you can hear a voice in your head. And if you pay attention to that voice, you might find it's your mom's voice or your dad's voice. And that's the superego. The superego is what's incorporated inside of us that our parents have instilled. And that's what we call conscience. Not conscious, conscience. Our idea of right and wrong. And it's typically learned, although we don't remember learning it, we experience it more like it's kind of like inborn, but of course it's not inborn. We learn morality, consciousness. You might find it interesting to realize that you now study theories of personality, but in psychodynamic theory and earlier psychology, we didn't study personality, we studied character. We didn't talk about personality psychology, we talked about character analysis. And think about, what's the difference between character and personality? Well, of course, character includes morality, one's character, and how one's self manifests around a sense of morality, around a sense of right and wrong, because then we have ideas of guilt and living up to certain ideals, an ego ideal self, etc. And when the scientific laboratory psychologists began studying this, they said, well, we have to be scientific, and science doesn't get involved in morality, just says what is. So they purged it of the morality and studied personality. This is also, interestingly, why personality theory is often kind of shallow and missing something, because once the psychodynamic theorist says, once you remove morality from the human experience, you're no longer talking about the human experience. This is also an interesting intersection between psychology, psychodynamic psychology, and philosophy and theology. When you get involved in any of these three disciplines, Freud, Jung, the psychodynamic theorists come into the discussion. In philosophy, we have individuals who preceded Freud, mostly Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. Both of these individuals were said most of what Freud had already said. Freud made it applied philosophy. He made it into applied, something you did with a patient. Whereas the philosophers wrote about it and thought about it, but didn't work with patients in this way. It's probably useful to point out, too, that this superego, students often think superego is something positive, something good. Oh, the superego's good and the id's bad. Actually, the superego can torment the individual as much as the id. In other words, if you've met someone who's overly moral, we call this an authoritarian character. You know, the individual who always likes to point out who's sinning, who's the sinner, who's not living up to, the best possible person. This is called the authoritarian personality. It's a sadomasochistic personality. It's someone who is ruled by their superego. They're in a constant state of antagonism to be the best they can be, or to be good, or to be righteous, or etc. And this is a torment. The superego makes demands of us that are tormenting. So your ego can be tortured by the superego or by the id. And through analysis, we discuss this, and Freud said that we come to realize where our energies are being displaced. And once we realize that maybe we are attached to the superego, like our energies are all about being pejorative, being opinionated and judgmental about other people, and who's not good enough, and who's how we're better than this person, and etc. That all the energies get placed in the superego, and it causes an imbalance of the character structure. And then, as you know, that's as you might know, that's very torturous to live through. And it's also very torturous to have a friend or be around people who are like that, judgmental people. So it's torturous to be judgmental, and it's torturous to be around those who are judgmental. And the idea here is an analyst introduces the analysand, or the client, the patient, to themselves. Bring this to the person's attention. Now, you might not realize that you're being super judgmental of other people. And your friend might not realize it or see it in themselves, but you might see it in other people, and they might see it in themselves, because this is one of the ego defense mechanisms. And you'll see these listed on page 150, 151, 152. So when we see in other people things we don't want to see in ourselves, we call this projection. We're projecting onto other people. So in this way, when you go to a movie and you talk about that movie afterwards, you might find that your friend and you and your friend have two different opinions of the same movie. Who's right? Well, the truth is, when you talk about what you've seen, you're talking more about yourself than you are about the movie. Anis Nin, the author Anis Nin, says, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So remember, when you go to an art museum, anytime you give your opinion on something, you're really giving more of an opinion, more of a description of how you view the world than the thing that you're actually talking about. And this is the view of projection. You're projecting onto things yourself. This is how you can use ink blots, or you can use stories. As you will see, we can use the sandbox and sand play, and we can use play therapy as a way of projecting the unconscious onto these other things. And in this way, we can get a point of view of the character structure, not by looking at the character, by looking at how the character is being projected onto other things. So these defense mechanisms are very valuable. We can analyze the use of defense mechanisms the way we analyze the dream, to kind of sketch out and get an idea of what the unconscious looks like. And once we have a picture of the themes that are, if you're working with a child who's always playing or making up stories or drawn to games or something that have to do with fighting and dominance and winning, etc., you're getting a look at this person's worldview. This isn't simply, I like playing games in which I fight and beat other people. You're getting a worldview, you're getting a glimpse into this individual's worldview. Psychoanalysts call this Weltanschauung. That's W-E-L-T, A-N, Weltanschauung, S-C-H-A-U-N-N-G. Weltanschauung, this is worldview, and it's very central to the psychodynamic idea. You're trying to understand the Weltanschauung. You're not simply treating depression. You're not treating bipolar mania. You're not treating schizophrenia. You are understanding how symptoms are manifesting in the context of an individual's character. And in this way, no two symptoms manifest in the same way in different people. Everyone's sense of being in the world is uniquely is a unique identity to that individual. So as the counselor, the analyst, you have to be aware of these defenses. Some of the defenses that are found in children: acting out, compensation, denial, fantasy, fixation, identification, projection, rationalization, undoing, withdrawal. And then we have some that are more complicated in some ways: displacement, intellectualization, reaction formation, regression, repression and suppression, and sublimation. And once you get to know these different strategies for protecting the ego, and again, what is protecting the ego? That is, we have an idea of who we are, and we grasp and cling on to this idea of our identity. Why? Because somehow psychically we confuse the threat to the physical organism with the threat to our identity. So we cling on to this view of ourselves because if that is challenged or turns out not to be true, it's almost like dying. It's an existential threat. This term existential threat is thrown around in the media today, talking about environmental stuff, global warming. That's not existential threat. Existential threat in this scenario, in this case, is a threat to one's sense of self and existence, not physical existence, psychical existence, identity. In this way, when someone challenges the way you want to see yourself and the way you want others to see you, and they challenge us, you get hostile, you get angry, you fight. We all do this. We fight tooth and nail to protect our sense of self. We say they got it wrong. We become defensive, as if it's something that it's going to kill us if we don't. In fact, it is a killing of the ego. It's a threat to our sense of identity. Ego meaning identity here. So we protect ourselves from anything that we see as a threat to our sense of identity. We do this through acting out. Something happens that is affecting our sense of volition and identity and autonomy, and we act. The little children act out. They throw tantrums, seek revenge. They can compensate. That's they cover up a weakness by emphasizing something else, some other strength they have. So they keep talking about how good they are at a video game or something. Denial. They won't even see a certain thing that's threatening to their sense of identity. Again, we also see these things in adults. Fantasy. Getting so lost in a certain fantasy that it becomes the reality. I knew a young child who wanted to play soccer on a soccer team, and the parents wouldn't let the child play the soccer. And I had no idea the child was talking about all of their teammates and how they played this game and how they did whole elaborate stories, only to find out that the child wasn't on a team. They were fantasizing of this. So the fantasy becomes a way to fulfill a wish. Children can't autonomously go out and fulfill their wish. They need their parents to help them accomplish fulfilling wishes. So this is often where fantasy comes in with children. They create a fantasy world as a way of protecting their sense of identity. They can use fixation, where they become, in order to protect themselves in moments where their identity is threatened. I use the word ego again. Their ego is threatened. Their sense of self is threatened. They might fixate on something that captures their attention, so almost they can distract themselves from what you're saying. I worked one time with a child that constantly, anytime that they were challenged to do something that or acknowledge something that was threatening to them or was something they caused them anxiety, they would start talking about video games. They're ruminating and fixating on a video game. It's an escape mechanism. Identification. Children will find someone that represents an adult or a fiction character, someone in a movie or a video game or a story, and they will identify with that character and try to emulate that person, that character, try to become as much like that person as they can. And this can be very useful, but it's also a way of protecting, convincing oneself of what one wants to be. Rationalization. Rationalization is when you come up with some justification to do something that's self-serving. So in rationalization, I could finish my homework if my little brother would stop bothering me. So this is like blaming someone else for your own shortcomings. This would be a rationalization. And that's very different from intellectualization. As you'll see, In intellectualization, the example they give in the textbook is just rationalization. Intellectualization is actually, when you have that argument with your lover and they say, let's stick to the facts. That's emotion. That's subjective. I want to stick to the objective facts. Yes or no. That's intellectualization. Intellectualization is distancing oneself from any type of emotional response and sticking only to the logic, intellectualized argument. It's an avoidance of emotion. So your book here gets that wrong. Intellectualization in their example. I'm underachieving child says, I learn best from doing things outside of school. That's not intellectualization. That's rationalization. Intellectualization is when you avoid emotions by sticking to some sort of, say, scientific... scientists overly intellectualize things. Whenever you have a psychologist who wants to talk about neurotransmitters and not feelings, they're intellectualizing. It's a way of distancing oneself from the threat of an emotional experience. Reaction formation is another one to be aware of. It's when people overemphasize a certain characteristic to the point that it becomes absurd. And typically it's to convince not only others but themselves of something that they're trying to hide from themselves. It's a mouthful, so let me explain this to you. An individual who wants to smoke cigarettes will become very, very opinionated about people who smoke and how dirty they are, and maybe even become president of the anti-smoking league and talk about how bad cigarettes are, and then secretly they're smoking cigarettes out in private when no one knows it. Or sometimes you'll find the certain religious leader or a pastor who is living such a righteous life and maybe speaking out against the ills of pornography, or speaking about how homosexuality is a sin, and then you find that, of course, they're a cocaine addict and sleep with homosexual prostitutes, etc., have a porn collection. This is classic reaction formation. And again, we all do it in some way, shape, or form, but it becomes a strong defense when people are doing it in an emphasized way when it comes to rule their lives, and as in the dramatic examples that I just gave to you. So we want to look for all of these defense mechanisms. And what do you do with them? Well, you use them to question the child so they get a more accurate understanding of what they're doing. So you might say to the child, every time we talk about your difficulties with your homework, you start talking about video games. Help me to understand what's going on there. And you can, if the child's a little older, the adolescent, you can bring to their attention what they're doing. A lot of these defense mechanisms, we are completely unaware that what we're doing. And we need that person outside of ourselves to point it out to us. And the idea is, once we understand what we're doing, we become aware of it, and we have we've integrated an aspect of the unconscious into consciousness. We've expanded our sense of identity. So make sure that you really familiarize yourself with these defense mechanisms and understand, oh boy, they're great for personal understanding of your own self, but understand that they serve to protect one's sense of identity, and that the only way that you become an authentic person, authentic, is to become aware not of who you want others to believe you are and who you want yourself to be. You have to become aware of a bigger picture of yourself, which includes the tricks you play on yourself not to know who you are. And those are the defense mechanisms. And then you can begin to catch yourself when you're doing it. When you are becoming judgmental about someone, say, oh boy, here's an opportunity to learn about myself. Because it might be that I'm putting on to them, I'm seeing in them something I don't want to see in myself. Take it as an opportunity to learn. Another opportunity is defensiveness. Whenever you feel defensive, put up your dukes, ready to fight, ready to tell the person how they got it wrong. That's an opportunity to examine why it's such an emotional reaction. Why is it so necessary to prove the other person wrong? Maybe there's some truth to it. Things that we find no truth to, we typically don't have an emotionally invested reaction to. We just say, oh no, that's not correct. But when we become violently opposed to something, there's something deeper knocking at our door. So we take defensiveness as an opportunity to get to know ourselves better. Okay. So I want to point out, your book talks there's a diagram on 146. And they have the conscious, the preconscious, the unconscious, and then the subconscious. And I just want to point out that I have never heard Freud use the subconscious before. I don't know what that is. I've heard of the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious. The subconscious, I don't know. That doesn't come from Freud. That comes from something else. As far as I am aware of, after all these years, I'm not sure what that's about. And nevertheless, let's now look into the psychosexual stages of development. And these stages are combined in your textbook with the Ericksonian psychosocial stages. And these are extremely, extremely useful in combining them and using them, keeping them in mind when you're dealing with children at different ages. I want to also point out that there are some things that aren't exactly adding up to what I've read in the actual Erikson. So I am going to include the short chapter on the 7 Ages of Man that Erikson wrote. So you'll have from Erikson's own pen that you can read, and it's pretty thick, dense psychoanalytic reading. You probably aren't going to have time at this point to investigate it, but I want you to have it, and I would hope that you will read that at some point in your career to get a strong sense of what it's actually saying as opposed to what your textbook authors are telling you. I always think it's good to have primary source. Look at the primary source. You read what the textbook says, you listen to what Giobbi says, and then you read it for yourself. And then you read other books, and you'll find that there's a lot of interpretation going on. I'm giving you ideas that are different from what your textbook authors might be giving you, and you'll find that everybody who is writing on psychodynamic theory has a certain individual take on things. Read the primary source material in addition to the commentaries that the textbook gives you and that your professors give you and you might hear from your friends. Always go back to the primary source material. It's good policy. Let's take a look at these Freudian psychosexual stages alongside with the corresponding Ericksonian psychosocial stage. So in classic Freudian analysis, the ultimate unconscious anxiety is sexuality. And I think in childhood, this is a big one. For Erikson, as for Adler and Erich Fromm and other psychodynamic theorists, sexual taboo was eclipsed by social opinion. Today, I think that most people would agree that the real oppressor is social opinion. society's rules and the good opinion of others, etc., wanting to be liked. This often outweighs any type of sexual desires we have. We live in a period of time that's quite different than Freud's. Freud's period of time was so sexually repressed, so sexually rigid, that they would put tablecloths over the tables to hide the legs of the table because a leg might be suggestive. Sex was the big taboo. Today, judging on what I observe on the social media, maybe sexual attention is something that could use a little more taboo. Maybe people could use a little more censoring and looking to satisfy their needs for acceptance through jiggling their bodies. This is something, of course, that we would address in a psychoanalytic situation with an adolescent, maybe not a child, but adolescent for sure. Someone who's using their body to satisfy self-esteem needs. That's prime territory for psychoanalysis. Okay, so let's look at these psychosexual stages with Freud and the corresponding Ericksonian psychosocial stage and see what it reveals to us. We have in Freud the very first stage from like birth to 2 years. We have the oral stage, and it corresponds with Ericksonian's trust versus mistrust. So the oral stage has to do with biological satisfaction, where our desires and needs are satisfied from. And in the first age of life, the first stage of life from age 1 through from birth to 2, we satisfy that need through the mouth. And that can be done through, in the beginning, feeding, eating, sucking on the nipple, and also eventually crying and screaming and making words in the second year of life, putting together verbal communication. Freud said that the mouth is the primary area where satisfaction of desires take place. Those desires can be instinctual desires, so desired for thirst, desire for food, and we can have a situation where the parent, the mother, in the parents in psychodynamic theory, the relationship with the mother is distinctly different than the relationship with the father in psychodynamic theory, and you'll also today have psychodynamic theory that deals with same-sex parenting, which didn't exist in Freud's time. So psychodynamic theory has changed quite a bit to incorporate these things. So in someone who is overindulged through their mouth, that means there's too much feeding, too much nipple, too much sucking, too much crying. This individual becomes oral incorporative. That means too much. Every time that one gets anxious, they go to putting things in their mouth. More cheeseburgers, more sucking on the fingers, chewing the nails. It's oral incorporative. If the individual is not satisfied with orally, frustrated, they scream, they yell, they bite. This is called an oral aggressive character. So as an adult, the child becomes either oral incorporative or oral aggressive, or oral sadistic is another way of expressing it. And so this is an adult character style who likes to yell and scream and criticize and bite with their words. This is an oral sadistic, oral aggressive character style. And the individual who likes to be taken care of and babied and likes to eat and their anxiety away, things get nervous and they suck on things or smoke cigarettes, put things in their mouth. This would be an oral incorporative character. So you can teach parents how to parent, how to individually address a child that might tend to be overly oral or overly uh, overly aggressive incidentally, this is a great time to tell you that many of the times the child come in for therapy, and what's really needed is not counseling for the child, but parenting skills for the parents. You'll see, without a fail, you'll find that the very thing that the parents are bringing the child in for is something that they themselves are doing in their adult life in some way. Talk about projection. So many of the things that we see are really not things that are things that have to be changed in the child. It's things that the problems the parents created through really poor parenting. So a lot of child counseling has to do with teaching parents parenting skills. So if you see this child, or you're helping the family through family therapy, and you want to direct the parent, say the mother, to be aware of the 3 different types of crying that takes place that Brazelton points out in the fine. He's a psychoanalytic pediatrician, and I'm going to provide links to his books that you can look at on our Canvas page for this week. And you see here that he points out that the attentive mother knows when their baby's cry is for hunger, cry is for I need to be changed because I'm wet and uncomfortable, or crying, a type of cry that needs physical, embracing feeling of safety and protection. And the mother, father that become attentive to this fulfill that child's needs, and the child begins to develop a sense of trust in the world rather than mistrust, as Erickson talks. And the parent who doesn't do this, the parent who neglects the child, who really maybe resents the child and is even mean or terrible to it, or just ignores it, and this child develops a sense of mistrust of the world, a sense that the world is not a safe place for them to be in. And this comes to dominate their approach to living as an adult. We've all met the person who says, you got to look out for number one. No one else will. Look out for yourself. This is a person who has a sense of mistrust in the world. They can only trust themselves. It probably comes from this first 2 years of life and their experience with a parent who maybe didn't give them a sense of security and safety, or maybe threatened to leave them, abandon them of some sort. It's a very complicated dynamic that goes on here. But again, we have this very, very clear idea that adulthood, adult character structure, is rooted in the first 6 years of life. Donald Winnicott, really a useful person to get acquainted with in psychodynamic theory, along with Melanie Klein. That's another name that you can look into. Anna Freud, of course. But Winnicott, I'm going to read from your textbook. Winnicott and Piaget believe that children at 12 to 18 months old begin to form an identity based on their me and not me worlds during this oral or trust building stage. Erickson explains the conflict as learning to trust or mistrust based on how well the child's basic needs are met. The process of developing an identity begins when infants see their image reflected in their mother's expression as they look at their babies. Mothers who depressed under stress and have difficulty expressing their love by looking at the expressions send a disturbing message to their infants. The infant begins to sense, if mother seems not to love me or be pleased with me in what she sees, I may be unlovable. Children who fail to form a sense of trust may face lifelong struggles in relationships. Now keep in mind something. The next time you go to the fast food restaurant, or you're out at about and you see a little child with the mother or the father, and that parent's face is buried in their phone, texting or whatever it is they do, And the child is desperately looking for the eye contact to get this very sense of, I'm okay, I'm lovable. And instead it's being told to them, this is more interesting than you. This is what gets mommy's attention. This is what gets daddy's attention. Imagine what we're going to be dealing with in adulthood with this little child. This is something you're going to be seeing coming into your therapy practice. I didn't grow up with this. I didn't grow up with parents I didn't have to compete with a smartphone for my parents' attention and love. And based on your age, you may or may not have. But this is something that we are definitely going to be seeing repercussions from at some stage. And psychoanalysts are on it. They've done the research has even been done outside of psychoanalysis to show that children get a sense of security, love, embrace from eye contact. How do you feel as an adult if you go out with someone and they're looking at their phone instead of you? Imagine a 1, 2-year-old child, a 4-year-old child, 6-year-old child. All very important aspects to consider. Let's look now at 2 to 3 years old. For Freud, this is the anal stage. For Erikson, autonomy versus shame and doubt. So at this point, we're really seeing in Freudian terms the development of the superego. Remember the superego, right and wrong, judgment. How does this correspond with anal stage? Well, at this stage, potty training begins. And what is potty training? Potty training is self-control. It's pooping and peeing at the right place and the right time. What do we call controlling oneself to doing something at the right time or the right place? We call that law. We call that morality. We call that ethics. This is the birth of right and wrong, the birth of morality, and the birth of development of self-control. Being able to physiologically hold the bladder muscles, control the bladder, control the sphincter muscles to not make a bowel movement whenever the pressure comes, but to forestall the gratification of going to the bathroom and waiting until it's a more appropriate place or time. My goodness, this is reflected later in life with being able to forestall instantaneous gratification for a longer, bigger payoff. What's the secret of academic success? Being able to say no to the party and yes to staying home and studying or writing your paper. This is like holding the bladder or holding the feces in. To poop or pee at the right place or the right time, that's going to be most beneficial. It's integrating into society. So this is the very essence of learning self-control. Children who aren't taught to go to the bathroom and hold it and control themselves at the right place and the right time tend to become adults who have very poor impulse control. They have very poor ability to forestall anxiety and frustration and stick to it and have grit. And so now this is very interesting because for Erikson, this is a period of autonomy versus shame and doubt. What is autonomy? Well, autonomy is the individual who is self-directed. Self-direction is holding the bladder. It's not being, it's the ability to have self-control, to be autonomous, automat, self-naming. This is different from shame and doubt. Shame and doubt is when one hasn't developed their ability to have self-control and instead poops and pees and is rejected for doing this at the inappropriate place and time, in their pants or in the bed rather than in the bathroom on the toilet. It's all about forestalling gratification. So the child who has no boundaries set, who's allowed to poop or pee wherever they want, no boundaries of right or wrong are set, this child goes on to be, in later life, something called anal expulsive character. An anal expulsive character is someone who's sloppy and does whatever they want to and disregards other people that maybe they're roommates, or they're just very self-centered, very poor boundaries. And that is what Freud called the anal expulsive. The anal retentive character is one is too controlled. This is the individual who everything, when anxiety sets in, the suit gets buttoned up to the top and the tie's tied a little tighter. They love rules. The more rules, the more safety they feel. They feel more secure with more rules. That's anal retentive character style. And we begin to see this as a direct result of how parents parent and individual children interact in their environment. Autonomy versus shame and doubt, Freud's anal stage. Next, we turn to the phallic stage. This is the genitals, the penis and the clitoris, 3 to 6 years old. And this is Erikson's idea of initiative versus guilt. Your book says, self-manipulation of the genitals provides for a major source of pleasurable sensation at this age. The Oedipus complex also occurs during this stage. The female version is sometimes referred to as the Electra complex. Sexual and aggressive feelings and fantasies are associated with the genitals. Boys have sexual desires for their mothers and aggressive feelings towards their fathers. Girls develop hostility towards their mothers and become sexually attracted to their fathers. Attitudes towards people of the same sex and opposite sex begin to take shape. The key question for healthy development, according to classical psychoanalysis, is the phallic stages. How does the child handle competition with the same-sex parents for the affection of opposite-sex parent? Now, let me just tell you this. Freud made it clear that he thought there was actually unconscious Oedipal desire, sexual desire for the opposite-sex parent. Most contemporary psychoanalysts, psychodynamic thinkers see this as metaphor. In other words, it's more about being the apple of mommy's eye and seeing daddy as a competitor for mommy's affections. So it's more of a symbolic desire to be the one and only for mommy, for the son, the one and only for daddy, for the daughter. And the same-sex parent as being someone who's a threat for being the one and only favorite of that parent. And of course, then we have different instances where a little boy, instead of identifying, trying to be more like daddy, it tries to identify and be more like mommy. And this would affect sense of self, sense of, maybe we could even say, gender, and certain identity aspects. And although your chapter doesn't go into this, Freud talked about polymorphic perversity, the idea that sexual arousal can be pretty much attached to anything, and it's within these first 6 years of life where we become attached, where our sexual arousal becomes to attach to different images, and that could be a determining factor of bisexuality, heterosexuality, or homosexuality. So all this is more, has been expanded upon and discussed more in contemporary psychoanalysis. A lot of Freud's classic theory is just more indicative of the time that he lived in. So for the phallic stage, really what's happening here is genitals are becoming pleasurable. And there's a certain idea of identification with the same-sex parent. The idea that if I become more like that parent, there'll be less of a threat to me. Daddy, if I become more like daddy, this is called identification, if you remember from the defense mechanisms, becomes more like identification. If I become more like daddy, then he'll become less of a threat to me. And the threat being that mommy might like daddy more than she likes me. So this idea is reflected in initiative versus guilt. For Erikson, the idea of initiative versus guilt is, as the book says, Erikson's explanation of the stage initiative versus guilt focuses on the child's social involvement in relationships. Children who spend their time in play and other constructive activities develop initiative and competence. Children who do not develop initiative, they may experience guilt and feelings of incompetence during life. I actually think that the authors have confused that a little bit with industry and inferiority, which is the next stage. My understanding and reading of Erikson says that the little child is enjoying their genitals. They have their hands down their pants all the time. They're doing things to make themselves feel good. It just feels good. But socially, this comes into a problem. If you're playing with yourself in public and it feels good, then society will look at you like there's something you shouldn't be doing. Parents might even say, you scoundrel, you're going to go blind. Stop abusing yourself. They make you. That's the sense of guilt that Erikson's talking about. How does one integrate this pleasure, initiative versus guilt, this seeking of pleasure in one's life, and being okay with seeking that versus feeling guilt? And the thing to resolve here is learning the appropriate place and the appropriate time for doing such things. Yes, you do. You can enjoy your genitals and wash your hands. And don't do it in the supermarket. Don't do it at the Bob's Big Boy. You have to and this develops a certain sense of initiative. The other, sense of guilt. You're bad, you're naughty, etc. So I do think that this understanding of Erikson in this stage is, I think the authors misunderstand Erikson here. I provide you with Erikson's primary source text that you can read for yourself. Next, we have the latency stage, 6 to 11. Freud views this as a time where children are just about to go through puberty, and they are very much repressing all of their sexual desires, pushing them out of mind, and instead investing themselves in activities, social activities, playing sports, being on a team, playing a musical instrument, riding horses, etc. This is latency. Latency means a quiet period, a wait. 6 to 11. Erikson talks about industry versus inferiority. This is really a time of social acceptance. Is there something I have to offer the group, or am I rejected? Does the social group see me as someone who has something to contribute, or do they just largely dismiss and ignore me and not want me to play with them? This is all connected here in very similar things described by Freud from a more sexual drive point of view. You'll hear, by the way, I almost said biological. You'll hear people talk about Freud as being very biological, and they get confused. What do you mean? Because in our day and time, biological means neurotransmitters and serotonin and neurons and brain tissue. But for Freud, biology meant instincts, drives, not as specific, not down to the level of the cellular or the chemical, but the social biological level. Drives like animals. Finally, we get to the genital stage. For Freud, this is the ability to reproduce, to make children, to work, and to love. This is the genital stage. Genital doesn't mean genitals. It means generation, to generate, to produce. And for Erikson, this is identity versus role confusion. Ages, teenage years, 12, 13, 14, all the way up to 24. The individual is looking to form an identity. Who am I is the big question. Who am I? For Freud, it's the ability to find a purpose, an occupation, ability to find a partner, love, and an ability to reproduce, to create children. This doesn't mean psychotic love, where you're projecting something onto somebody else. That's not love. Love is the ability to care and to be with another person, not to use them as a way to satisfy your own ego needs or your own, like a masturbatory tool. So this is, again, stuff you really have to look into and study in depth. I'm just introducing this to you and hopefully turning you on to it so that you can read further. And like I said, so much in this chapter you're going to need to read it at least 3 times and then go look into other stuff on it, the primary source materials. I want to turn your attention to the page 155 in the text. This is so important. I want to read this to you. It's because it's so important. In psychoanalysis, the relationship is the agent of change. The relationship, again, is between the counselor and the patient, the analyzon and the analyst, the counselor and the child. It's the relationship that is the agent of change. The counselor is an expert who interprets the client's drives and defenses. They introduce the client to themselves. You're going to help this child to see things in themselves that you can see, but they cannot see in themselves. We all have this gift. We can all see things in another person that we're unaware of in that person's unaware of. People can see things in us that we're unaware of in ourselves. We can't see our own eyeballs. We can't taste our own tongue. We can't bite our own teeth. We can't tickle ourselves, right? This is the gift we have. So that relationship, transference is this central idea of this relationship. When that child begins to become attached to you in an emotional way, they transfer emotions that might be in conflict with father or the mother or someone else, a bully, onto you. And then you can manipulate those emotional experiences to bring to the child's attention the experience of working through it and resolving it. So the child will actually treat you in a way that could be hostile or fall in love with you or something like this, as if they're transferring certain emotions that are unresolved with the parent or with a teacher or some bully in school or something onto you, and you become symbolically that person that they need to resolve something with, and you can use that relationship to bring to their attention, to expand their attention and knowledge through frustrating the transference, not maybe doing bringing certain things that don't allow the satisfaction, so that then they have to work through it. So here's an example. I remember when I underwent a Jungian analysis, I looked up to the person who I had the analysis with was my teacher and my mentor, and I was very admired him very much, wanted to emulate him. And in one session, he said to me, "Do you realize you put me up on a pedestal?" I said, "Yes, of course. I admire you greatly. I admire your knowledge. I admire your accomplishments. I'd like to accomplish and live the kind of life you've lived. It's admirable." And he said, "When you put me up on a pedestal, you treat me the way you would like me to treat you. You treat me the way you would like me to view you." In other words, I was craving his approval, his acceptance, his, "Oh, Matthew, you're so wonderful, you're so brilliant." And instead, he wouldn't allow that to happen. He wanted me to put myself up on the pedestal, so to speak. Not in an egotistical way, but in other words, if he would have given in to that ego trip of being worshipped as a hero, instead he frustrated it and he said, "Be your own hero. Don't put other people up on a pedestal. Don't put me up on a pedestal. Be your own hero." Do you see how this works? Do you see how this transference works? Now, to me, or to the patient, we're just saying, "Oh, I admire this person. I'd like to be with them." But underneath that, we're transferring the desire to be approved of, to be loved, to be admired, all the things that maybe we would like to have from a parent or something like this. And this is where you can learn a lot about yourself by analyzing what kind of lovers you look for. And remember, in psychoanalysis, that's largely based on some unfulfilled aspect of the relationship with that opposite parent, sex parent in psychoanalysis. So when you have this situation that you call, oh, I'm so in love, what that could be is some kind of transference neurosis. Love typically isn't a sickness. If it's sickness, if you're in some kind of psychosis about another person, you can't live without them, and you're neurotic over them, that's transference. That's not love, probably. So you have to look into that. So the goals that are described here are incredible. Achieve a more adaptive and compromise between conflicting forces and understanding the nature of the conflicts and dealing with them. Okay, that's fancy talk. Getting to know yourself better, expanding consciousness, expanding, in Jungian terms, identity of ego into a more comprehensive understanding of the self that extends beyond ego, beyond identity. And this is shining light on unconscious aspects, getting to know yourself. How do you do it? Well, you do this through dream analysis. You do it through analyzing transference. You do this through analyzing fantasies, through free association, just talking freely without censoring oneself. That's the primary rule of psychoanalysis. Don't censor yourself. With children, you do it through play therapy. You do it through sentence completion, interpreting dreams, interpretation of dreams, looking at what makes someone laugh. You can really tell a lot about a person's view of the world by what they find funny. Humor. Freud wrote an entire book on humor as unveiling of the unconscious. Slips of the tongue, parapraxia. In psychoanalysis, there are very few mistakes. Freud said there are no mistakes, but any little error, forgetting something somewhere, might be a desire to stay there, to return to that person, etc. And also looking and analyzing those defense mechanisms, what we call resistance. People will come in and adults will say, I want to change, but then they fight you every step of the way. That's resistance. Sentence completion. You'll see examples of this on page 163. With children, books. Shel Silverstein, Dr. Seuss, and some children books that tell stories, and then talking about those stories with the children. And that's called bibliotherapy. You have cinetherapy as well, using movies to bring things to their attention about themselves. Making up stories. Play therapy, playing with action figures, and sand therapy, as we're going to explore. About drawing and art. This is all looking for themes with the child to understand what's dominating that child's Weltanschauung, their worldview, their sense of identity. Usually the play and artwork unveils things in the unconscious. And of course, when you take images from the unconscious and turn them into artwork, that's a way of expanding the conscious into the unconscious, as a way of integrating the unconscious of the individual into consciousness. We are only scratching the surface here. I think that this is enough of my talking and introducing this to you, and I hope that I've interested you enough to get you to read that chapter more than once and to watch some of the videos and really get turned on to psychodynamic counseling.